My name is Cecilia Weaver, and I will be presenting my research about James Monroe's Highland and its changing historical interpretation from 1975 until 2021. And I wanted to thank my research advisor, Dr. Maria Di Benigno, for her advice throughout this project. So, in looking at Highland's interpretation, I compared how contemporary news events were affecting the historical interpretation of Highland at any given time, tracing that process from when William and Mary came to own the property in 1975 until the present 2021. Historical interpretation is important to study because it's become a very touchy point in the news, with things like the 1619 Project being released and the backlash that came from it from both the public and the scholarly community in the debate surrounding it, as well as legislation that's being introduced throughout the United States to change what is taught about history in the K-12 level. Now, historical interpretation at historic sites is also important because it serves as a bridge between the public and scholars and how new information from scholars is presented to the public. At Highland itself, it wasn't home to just James Monroe. It was also home to an enslaved population who lived and worked on this plantation, as well as Monroe's family, including his wife, Elizabeth Monroe. So William and Mary gets Highland in 1975. J. Winston Johns gives this property to them in his will, who he was a previous owner. And this was a really interesting time to inherit a previous president's home because it was during the time when the Vietnam War was ending, during the Watergate scandal, and there was a potential resentment towards government, which is why perhaps William, Mary, and Highland, chose to shift its focus away from James Monroe and focus much more on a decorative art side, introducing in 1976 the Colonial Crafts Fair, which served as a picture of just a general 18th century life. Granted, it was a very white perspective, but had local artisans come in who taught about colonial crafting and things, arts such as woodworking and like dressmaking, things like that. And it sort of developed this decorative arts view, and it had peacocks on the ground, even though that wasn't something that was there when Monroe was there. Moving forward into the 1980s, in 1985, the Guerrilla Girls, an activist group which was focused on advocating for more women and inclusion in museums, was established, and this didn't lead to a significant increase at Highland of women's representation. However, discussions of Elizabeth Monroe sort of continued throughout Highland's history. In the later 80s, there was a shift away from this decorative art side and more about just the environment of Highland, including its outside grounds, as a space for performing groups and things to come along, which could have been as a result of increased environmentalism as a result of Chernobyl and the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Now, moving forward from like 1996 onward, there was a gradual increase in information about enslaved people at Highland, which could have been partly as a result of outside pressures from a group named Pepperbird Tours, which offered plantation tours of both Highland and the surrounding areas, including Mount Vernon and Monticello, and their African-American life and history at those. And this sort of continued onwards from Highland's history, including more perspectives of African Americans at colonial crafts fairs, which actually changed to be called Plantation Days in 1993, including some folk music and things along those lines. So then in the early to mid 2000s, there was a more greater increase on Elizabeth Monroe, which could partly be as a result of including there being more women in higher positions of government, such as Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, as well as more events aimed at adults, such as wine tastings, which could be partially as a result of the John Adams miniseries gaining popularity. Now, in 2018, there was a very exciting discovery at Highland, which was that the home that had been interpreted as James Monroe's home was actually a guest house, and this allowed the Highland itself to get into the news, and the descendant community of Highland, those who were descended from the enslaved people who lived and worked at Highland, they could learn about Highland itself and then became part of the Descendant Advisory Council at Highland, which has been consulted on their new interpretive plan, which was implemented during COVID when the when Highland itself was shut down, and their new exhibits were introduced to interpret the standing home as a guest house, including more enslaved perspectives of enslaved people, such as the people who would be setting up the home for a guest, and then also just focusing on Monroe himself rather than this general white person living in the 18th century. So to conclude, there was a lot less connection between one specific historical event and one specific historical interpretation. However, it's important to note that this picture sort of paints an idea of changing norms over time and these pressures that increased until Highland chose to make changes. So historical interpretation is affected by the outside world, but it's not a one-to-one necessarily. It's more about this gradual change over time. And then it's also important for Highland to know its own institutional history as a historic site so that it can understand ways it might have interpreted history differently over time and how it can perhaps remedy these in the future. So historical interpretation is important to study across many different levels, and Highland is just one of those.